So, welcome to Pieces of China, a China Institute series that tells the story of China one object at a time. I'm Dinda Elliott, and we are honored to have with us today Philip Tinari, who is director of the Ullens Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing and one of the world's leading experts on the topic. Philip is going to talk today about a black and white photograph that encapsulates one of the most electric moments in contemporary Chinese history. It shows the avant-garde stars exhibit in 1979, which signaled a dramatic break with the Cultural Revolution's Maoist ideology and launched an equally revolutionary new movement in Chinese art. The photograph was taken by artist Li Xiaobin and given to Philip last year by none other than STARS member Huang Rui. So Philip, let's get right to it. Tell us first, why is this photograph so important? And tell us a little bit about that moment in time.
So we can really, of course, there's a lot of art historical conversation about where Chinese contemporary art kind of, when it begins and where it comes from. But one moment we could really certainly point to is the STARS exhibition, which happens in late September of 1979. The 30th anniversary of the PRC, shortly after the new constitution, alongside a lot of agitations towards democracy and free expression that are happening in all kinds of other sectors. And it's really a moment when artists who are coming straight out of the Cultural Revolution, who hadn't been trained, hadn't been in the academies because they'd been closed, had been kind of working in factories or in other kinds of situations in and around Beijing, came together over the summer before that and started to think about putting a show on together. And this name, the STARS, in opposition to, say, the singular sun, i.e., Mao, who was now gone for a few years. And the manifesto they wrote was all about the importance of the individual, the importance of expression, and the importance of art. And so this exhibition, which they mount on the fences, in the East Garden, outside of what's now called the National Art Museum of China, the National Gallery, the sort of the crown jewel of the official art system. It draws lots of curious people, and there's a whole story about, there's a whole conversation and academic debate about to what extent this was permitted, because actually, of course, the local police didn't really like what they saw, and so this exhibition only went on for 2 days or so before it was sort of called off. But a year later, the STARS were showing on the other side of this fence, inside the National Art Gallery. But I also just love this photo because, it's a picture of people in Beijing looking at art. And that's been what I've been engaged in for the last 10 years at UCCA, is putting on exhibitions for an exhibition going public there. So it's sort of this beautiful bridge between then and now.
Right. It's such a beautiful snapshot, a moment in time as well. I mean, it just brings us immediately back to 1979, and you just kind of can't believe that the China of today is connected to that moment. It's kind of an incredible thing.
Yeah, and I mean, for artistic revolutionaries, which the STARS were, their work is actually formally quite unresolved in a way. I mean, you have all kinds of different tendencies. You can almost start to see in this image everything from figurative painting to ink landscapes to, of course, things like the sculptures of Wang Keping. But a few years later, the art scene gets more serious and people start reading philosophical and art historical texts and reacting to them. But this is just kind of this moment of unadulterated, highly experimental, almost naive is maybe too strong a word, but it's a kind of very youthful creativity. I mean, these artists
it's certainly
in
raw.
their 20s.
It's certainly
raw.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So the contemporary Chinese art scene has come such a long way since that moment. Top artists, we know the top artists' work now sells for millions of dollars internationally. So tell us a little bit about what you've seen, what that journey's been like from when you lived there first in 2001, I guess it was, and the 798 Art District was just founded, to the Guggenheim show that you co-curated a few years ago, and then to today. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of changes over the years.
Yeah, so I mean, I arrived on this contemporary Chinese art scene about halfway between the moment in that photo and the present moment now. in kind of every way. So it was the end of a sort of more underground avant-garde kind of scene and the beginning of a more public, more commercial kind of scene. And, you know, one of the important things that happened was contemporary art in the early 2000s sort of stopped being contraband, right? And the art academies started to teach these experimental techniques and outlooks that had once gotten artists in all kinds of trouble. And sure, that undergrounded things like a market run-up, and later on the foundation of all kinds of private museums. We're in this very interesting moment now where on the one hand you have, you know, a political tightening, of course. If we look at Hong Kong yesterday and, you know, so many other things, but you also have in cities like Beijing and Shanghai, but also Hangzhou and Chengdu and wherever else, really just in the last 3 to 5 years, the explosion of a public for contemporary art. So there's just more people interested than ever before, which is kind of, to me, offsets this tension and this tightening in an interesting way. Yeah.
So over the years, have you been concerned, intrigued? What is your, obviously there's been this explosion of creativity and experimentation over the past 30 years in terms of artistic expression. At the same time, you know, with China's economic modernization, there's been increasing commercialism and pressure on, you know, making money. Making money is the ultimate goal for many people. And so I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit about the commercialism in the art world and whether that's been a concern of yours and how, you know, how that's evolved and how Chinese artists, you know, wrestle with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, people weren't thinking commercially in the photograph we're looking at, right? It was kind of before all of that, and the 80s were before all of that. You know, you had this national scene kind of tied together by magazines and debates that unfolded, and then it was really in the 90s that, you know, after the upheavals of '89, that you started to have a market, a lot of times mediated by Taiwan and Hong Kong, and Europe and America for that matter. And then the next wave is really after 2000 and really after 2008. So in the wake of the financial crisis, the scene sort of puts itself back together, and it's no longer dependent on people like, you know, our original Ullens or people like Li Xiaobin, and instead you start to have all these sort of Chinese collectors involved, who of course are commercially interested parties, but who also, you know, start to do things like put together their own institutions, and get involved with institutions like ours. So yeah, you know, it's commercialism is one piece of it, but it's also just like the maturation of a scene on a much larger level. And I think people, you know, it's important to remember that the higher ups, let's say, have left this space, at least until now, for private museums, right? Which is a phrase I don't even really like that much, because it sounds sort of so selfish, when really what they are is the kind of public facing piece of the contemporary art world that's just kind of handled outside of the state institutions by and large, with a few notable exceptions.
Is the rise of private museums dicey in any way in terms of people, you know, are there standards that are different from standards of museums elsewhere in the world, and how is that evolving?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's in the great phrase of Deng Xiaoping, you know, feeling the river by crossing the stones, right? Crossing the river by feeling the stones. Yeah. There's a lot of learning by doing, and you know, there's a lot of reverence for established models, but there's also a real consciousness of the ways in which they don't exactly obtain, right? There's, you know, the American model of an institution held in the public trust by a body of kind of private individuals, subject to certain regulations and, you know, enjoying certain advantages for the in recognition of their support. That doesn't quite happen here. So, you know, or more the kind of newer institutions, a lot of times it's one individual, and in our case, we have a whole kind of collective of people who are involved. But you know, I think a new kind of model is kind of emerging, and I think most importantly, new audiences are coming to the table all the time.
Back to the photograph, you know, again, it was such a raw moment and such a non-commercial moment, right? So I'm curious as to whether you've had conversations over the years with artists who have been grappling themselves with the pressures of the market, and how do they come to terms with that?
Yeah, I think, when I was first getting involved in the early 2000s, it was this really transitional moment when these artists artists kind of my generation who cut their teeth kind of in basement exhibitions and sometimes dicey, even gory kinds of circumstances, were suddenly facing this whole thing. And there was an inevitable kind of awkwardness. And it's funny, I was just reading tonight, the book Andrew Solomon wrote in the late 80s about the Soviet art scene. And he talks about the first show they had in Berlin in 1988 or whatever it was, and kind of the awkwardness of that initial encounter. That's well in the past now. And instead what you have is this younger generation who probably did their MFA in London or New York and then have come back and or if they haven't left, that's fine too, because they've read everything they need to on the internet, and most of the relevant art media is kind of translated into Chinese in real time, whether that's Art Forum or Art News or whatever it is, or ArtNet. So there's just, the kind of breadth of the conversation and the back and forth and the ways in which people can keep informed on what's going on all over the world. Even in this moment of kind of anti-globalization, it's on this informational level, at least, it's hard to foresee that being undone.
Yeah, and it's become such a global phenomenon, to the extent where there's obviously a big debate among Chinese artists about should we be seen as Chinese artists or not. And I'm curious to talk about a moment about the Guggenheim show. One of the really interesting, a couple of years ago that you were the co-curator. One of the things I thought was so fascinating about that show was the way in which it talked about the fact that art had been very much sort of facing towards the West for a number of years at the beginning, because the West was the only place that sort of appreciated it. And then some of it became criticized because of that, because artists were, just Chinese people, the audiences were saying, you're just pandering to sort of Western audiences, whatever. So talk a little bit about the Guggenheim show, why that was an important show, and also how, you were just talking about how how the market has changed and how the world that Chinese artists exist in now has changed.
Yeah, so we were really trying to tell this story about the 2 decades between 1989 and 2008, which for people who follow China in any way are not years you need to, not years of which you need to explain the significance, right? But this sort of 1920-year period kind of encapsulates this larger 40, 50-year transition, in that it takes us from a time when an art scene and a culture more generally is essentially hermetic to one where it's kind of constitutive of this much larger global order. And I think one of the things we were trying to argue indirectly, or one of the claims we were trying to make that was maybe even larger than the particular pieces on view, was that this idea of global contemporary art, which also comes to the fore in the 90s and into the 2000s, kind of needs China to be truly global. So it's not just that the Chinese artists were trying to show their work in the West. It's more that as the art world globalized in the post-Cold War kind of moment, China also came into the fold. Or you could say, as China came into the fold, the art world globalized. I think those things kind of happened in parallel, and now we're in this very different place.
Let's go back again to the photograph. So it's got a personal significance to you as well, right? It was given to you last year by Huang Rui. So tell a little bit about that and why it's important to you personally.
Sure. Yeah. Well, when I got your prompt, which I love this series, I think it's such a great way to kind of talk about so many different topics. This occurred to me just because Huang Rui, this great artist, one of the protagonists of The Stars, the protagonist, really the first artist to kind of settle in, one of the first artists to settle in 798, where UCCA's flagship is located. He and his wife Berenice, and then actually another couple who were the French cultural attaché and his partner at the time, gave it to me. It was my 40th birthday. So I was actually born in the year of the Stars exhibition, just a few months before. So obviously was not there personally. But so we had this fun kind of evening party, and it was actually a few days after the opening, the weekend of the opening of a show we did last year, which was called Picasso: Birth of a Genius, which was just a total blockbuster for us at UCCA. And I think the one reason they selected it is because this is, in the end, it's a photo of people at an exhibition looking at art. And that was, I sometimes have given talks where I'll put the stars and then the lines for our Picasso show kind of next to each other. And I think it's a really kind of amazing way to encapsulate, this transformation, this explosion, this expansion that's happened in these 4 decades. So yeah, I mean, it was just this idea of kind of being given this photo of this earlier moment, at this other kind of, maybe not equally significant, but at least somehow parallel kind of moment in the art history of contemporary China. I don't know, just maybe reflect on this larger story and the role that we all play in it.
Absolutely. So unfortunately, I've got to stop us here as we're out of time, but I promise that we will try to get Philip Tinari back again to talk about art in longer form. I hope you will join us again, Philip. I want to thank you all for joining us. This episode will be uploaded on YouTube, so you can share with others, and join us next week on Thursday, July 9th, to hear from American Chinese rapper Bohan Phoenix, who's going to talk about Rap of China, which that TV show which changed his life. Finally, I want to encourage you all to become members of China Institute. Your support brings with it great discounts, of course, but it also allows us to bring brilliant speakers like Philip Tinari and our other great programs. So thank you so much, Philip, for helping us tell the story of China.
My pleasure. Great to be here. Thank you.